Gurmagat a lascian chordia agus gurmin mahada ara as on Villa Shaw a Hogal. In Gado Chisa Ara, I would like to welcome those organisations who are watching in the gallery. We have the Union of Students of Ireland, the Students' Union of UCD, Trinity, SETU, Maynooth, DCU, University of Galway and IADT. It is thanks to those students' unions, the students themselves, who have been advocating for years for this type of legislation to come before the Dáil, and I want to thank each and every one of them for their patience, for their guidance and their assistance in bringing forward this bill and helping us draft this bill. This bill is for them. It's for the people that they represent, their parents, and Minister, it is also for those people who open their doors and welcome people into their homes. We want to finally provide some rights and protections to those students who do live in digs accommodation. And Minister, I think that is at this stage only right. We're aware, Minister, that there is a severe housing crisis. It used to be a situation where people may have lived in digs accommodation for 1 year in their first year as they made that transition from their home life to student life. But now the reality is that because of the extremely high cost of student accommodation, thanks to this government's approach in terms of having vulture fund-led student accommodation, this is the only option for so many people. It is so welcome that people open their doors in this regard, but it is so important that students who are living in this type of accommodation have some basic protections. Minister, you'll be aware, of course, that there is a generous tax subsidy of €14,000 available for those who are renting out their rooms, and we believe that it is only fair that if the state is going to pay up to €20 or €30 million a year on this tax relief, then recipients should be obliged to have some protections. Threshold have pointed out that these student renters have effectively no rights. Hence, our bill here tonight is designed literally to address this. And Minister, as things currently stand, students can be evicted overnight, and that happens. And then the likes of these students' unions have to scramble and try and find accommodation for those students who are thrown out overnight, and they are at risk of homelessness. Our bill would provide a notice period of 30 days in most circumstances. Currently, students have no right to privacy, such as being allowed to simply put a lock on their door. Minister, as a woman, I can tell you one thing: I would not feel comfortable living in a shared house without having the ability to lock my door. And this is an issue that has been raised with me by so many students because they have had that concern. And I'm sure you'd agree that being allowed to lock your door is a fairly basic right. Minister, there is currently no right to reasonable use of the household's facilities. We've all heard what happens to people where they mightn't be able to use the kitchen until after 10 o'clock at night. And there's many incidents where students' deposits aren't returned for spurious reasons. And then they have no means to the use of the RTB for dispute resolution. And there has been instances as well, Minister, where suddenly rents have increased dramatically because under the current lack of regulation or legislation, these types of accommodations do not fall under the rent pressure zones. And that's why our bill would require that the rent be set out as part of an official licence agreement and would bring properties within the scope of the rent pressure zones. It is important as well to point out that this bill does provide protections to students that currently just don't exist, but it will also provide protections to the householders themselves, because it requires, it means that there's obligations on the part of the student renter to pay their rent in full, or if the student or the person engages in antisocial behaviour or damages the property, then the homeowner themselves can go to the RTB to seek redress. But Minister, this is something that students have long been campaigning for. This is about having basic rights for students who are living in digs accommodation. They are, for many people, the only solution at this very moment in time in terms of rental accommodation. They need to have protections. They need to be able to lock their door at night time so that they don't have to worry and sleep with one eye open because they are worried about what might happen. They shouldn't have a situation whereby they don't know if they're going to be thrown out one day to the next. They should have some kind of a notice period. This bill will provide that. They should have reasonable access to facilities so that they can do their cooking, so that they can put on a wash or whatever it may be. I'm really happy that this bill is coming in front of the Dáil, and I'm really pleased that you won't be opposing it, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
We had the RTB in the Housing Committee today, and it was a really informative meeting. There is no doubt there are changes that need to be made to improve services provided by the RTB. However, the current system for students living in digs doesn't even allow them to bring a case to the RTB. This bill would allow both homeowners and tenants to access the RTB, and it's a vital protection for everyone. But what it also means is that we will no longer, hopefully, hear the horrific circumstances of students being evicted without notice, or students who are not allowed to use the kitchen or even the home they're in. It would mean that students will be entitled to the basics: a rent book, protection against rent increases, and a right to privacy. Right now, we have young female students going into accommodation with no entitlement to lock the door. But you have young men as well in the same position. How can this be right, that you go to sleep at night not knowing if someone can come into your room? This is completely wrong. And right now in Cork, we have a crisis in student accommodation. It's unbelievable the pressure that students and their families are going, because there is a huge shortage of beds, especially affordable beds. So digs have a really positive alternative to play, and in many circumstances they work, and it can be a really positive experience both for the homeowner and the students. But when it doesn't work, it can be a nightmare for the student in particular. That's why this bill is so vital. For too long, students' rights have been ignored. Now it's time that we give them the rights and the respect they deserve.
The crisis of student accommodation has become a significant issue affecting students and their families across our country, and including the people of my own constituency in Meath West. Private companies are exploiting students and their parents. These companies use deceptive tactics, such as claiming that properties need renovations, to remove students from their accommodation. Once the students are displaced, the companies then hike the rents on the new accommodation by extortionate amounts. This is a clear exploitation of students and their families, who are already financially strained. I spoke to students in my constituency who last year paid $8,000 for their accommodation. This year they got quotes of $10,000, which is an increase of 25% in a rent pressure zone, where rents are only supposed to go up 2%. This pattern of exploitation is not an isolated incident. It is a widespread issue that is causing immense hardship for students and their families. The financial strain of high rent, coupled with the emotional toll of unstable living conditions, severely impacts students' ability to focus on their academic pursuits. Access to affordable and secure accommodation is crucial for their success. The current system places an undue burden on students, particularly those not eligible for grants, forcing them to pay extortionate rents and endure unstable living conditions. It is essential that measures are put in place to regulate the practices of private housing companies and provide support for students seeking accommodation, as has been previously pointed out. The current state of the rental sector, especially for individuals renting rooms in homes where the owner also resides, also comes with a number of issues. These students in some cases have been denied rights concerning the reasonable use of shared facilities like the kitchen and the bathroom, and the right to lock in their bedroom door. Student renters have been without access to a notice period and have been unable to seek recourse through the RTB in cases where their deposits have been unfairly withheld. Digs accommodation offers a workable solution to the shortage of student housing within the sector, and by addressing the deficiencies in protections and rights for students in these living arrangements, the Government can help alleviate the student accommodation crisis. Students need rights and protections they deserve, and this bill will do that. Thank you.
At the outset, I want to acknowledge the important role that digs accommodation plays in providing accommodation for students. I'm very proud that Limerick is a wonderful university city, with the University of Limerick, the Technology University of Shannon, Mary I campus and Art College, amongst others, all based in Limerick City. Students are a vibrant and welcome addition to the Limerick population and provide value to Limerick and its surroundings. Digs are an important source of accommodation for students. It is generally cheaper than the other rental accommodation options when they exist, be they on campus or off campus. And in several cases, you hear of wonderful bonds being formed between the host family and the student. Aside from the financial cost of rent, for many parents of new students, having their young adult beginning their college experience in digs offers a level of peace of mind that may be more independent side of renting may not afford them. Without the availability of digs accommodation, many more students will be struggling to find accommodation, as we know there is a lack of affordable or available rental properties in or around Limerick. It is normally this time of year when my office begins fielding calls from students and their families who are desperately seeking accommodation. With Deputy Maureen Farrell, we recently met UL, Mary I and TUS students regarding the accommodation crisis that students in Limerick are often experiencing. Looking at the cost of student accommodation, digs is dramatically more affordable than other options. I look at the price of digs accommodation in Limerick. The average cost is €150 per week with the accompaniment of an affordable deposit. Rented on campus can be quite expensive, with on-campus accommodation in UL starting at €5,343 in a shared 8-bedroom with a €450 deposit for the academic year. Appreciating this, however, there remains an absence of regulation around this type of accommodation. It is regulation needed to protect not just the student renter, but the household who are providing the accommodation. Without a level of regulation, there is no protection for renters from the overnight eviction. There is no protection against potentially prohibitive house rules regarding facility and kitchen access, and there is no protection to students who may wish to lock the door of their own room. Again, the vast majority of providers of this accommodation don't operate in such a manner, but there are some that do, and a protection must be put in place against bad practices. Those who offer to rent a room accommodation can avail of up to €14,000 of tax relief, with the average savings as per 2018 figures of 2,100, with such subsidy must be an obligation to protect these student renters. Householders want to formalise the arrangement, so do students. This bill offers simple protections such as the access to rent book, a minimum notice period, a right for students to lock their bedroom door, recourse from both parties to the RTB, and rights for householders to have recourse for property damage, late rent payments and antisocial behaviour at the property. Students and digs providers need affordability, need security. Other rental options just aren't affordable or sufficient in stock in Limerick or market.
Minister, first of all, I want to commend both Deputy Farrell and Deputy O'Brien for bringing forward this piece of legislation. The Rental Tenancies Amendment Bill 2024 is to establish some form of contract between the householder and the tenant who would rent the room in the house in this particular case. And in many cases, and I have, I suppose, very much first-hand experience of this. Last year I had 3 in college together, and this coming year we'll have 2 go to college. So I'm well aware of the huge costs involved, and also the huge struggle in the first place to find accommodation. That's the first thing that everyone who has a child going to college has in any part of the country, no matter where they go, whether they come to the capital city in Dublin here, or to Galway, or to Limerick, or to wherever. They have the same problems, is to try and find anywhere. And one of the, I suppose, issues that we come across is that very many of the students, particularly when they go to a friend group, they want to rent a house along with that friend group, and they want to get a house together somewhere. But the problem we have is that the rental sector, the standard rental sector for everybody, is putting huge pressure on that. Houses that used to be available for students are no longer available, and other families are now renting them on a longer term basis, and they're getting higher rents for them. So they've moved out of the situation. And the only option for many students going is to go into digs. And very often that can work out very well, as has been said, and in most cases, in fairness, it does work out very well, and most of the landladies look after them very well and become a kind of a second mother to some of them in many cases, and that's absolutely perfect and fine. But there are the instances where things don't work out well. There are the instances where some students mightn't keep to the standard rules that they have at home when they let their hair down when they go out to college, and you know there can be issues with difficulties that they may have there, and we need to have some form of agreement in place to make sure that everyone knows what's expected of them, that they're supposed to pay their rent in time, that they're not supposed to act the blackguard too much, at least, except maybe during rag week they might get away with it, but for the rest of the time at least, that they have got, you know, some sense of the responsibility that they have as a tenant, but also particularly that the person who's renting out the room also have responsibilities to provide the proper kind of accommodation, to make sure, number one, that there's heat on in their rooms, is one of the things that I've heard about, and very often in the winter time, huge problems with that, issues with access to kitchens, with access to cooking facilities, all of those sort of things, another huge problem that they can have in many cases. So really this is about trying to formalise something which will provide for both, which will ensure that everybody can be respectful to each other, and when it's written down on paper and there's a contract in place and they have recourse to a governing body, it puts everybody in the right place. And I welcome that the government have said that you're not going to oppose this particular piece of legislation. But I would hope that you would not just oppose it, but that you'd actually embrace it, that you'd make sure that this would happen and be put in place for everybody, because we certainly need to recognise that this is becoming a growing sector. And the fact that there's such a large, I suppose, tax-free allowance in place for people who rent out a room of $14,000 a year also puts a responsibility on the state to ensure that they get involved in this and make sure that there's fair play for everyone involved.
Those of us who have had children in college know what a money pit third-level education can be, and if anybody's watching and their children are small, I'd advise them to start saving now. But when they have to go away to college and, digs, that's when the rent cruelty and the risk often happens, and that's what we're trying to prevent with these provisions. So I commend my comrade Teachta Mairead Farrell for working on this PMB along with Ona Bryn. Maynooth University, I was listening to Martin Kenny there talking about Rag Week, and we have Christmas Day, and we've always a party in Maynooth. Maynooth is where I live, and it's in my constituency, and I'm well aware of how parents and students themselves are put to the pin of their collar to make the rent when they're attending Maynooth University for their course, and digs is really handy. It makes it a lot more affordable. But when rents and living costs are so high, we all have a duty to look after students in the informal arrangements of digs when they're renting a room in a house, and they have very little protection in that tenancy or indeed any tenure. But we've all heard and know about the horror stories, arriving in the house to find that they have also housework to attend to, or they might have au-pair duties that weren't mentioned at all. Kids being kicked out in the middle of the night and frantic and all that kind of stuff. And there's also the issue of not being able to have a lock on their door. And Mairead Farrell discussed that earlier on, and that's really critical when we're talking around the safety of our girls and our women. So I'm very glad with what we're proposing here tonight, because it balances any previous imbalance in the relationship where people letting out the rooms had extremely good tax breaks, but the person renting had very few protections at all. Simple things like a rent book, entitlement to the 30 days notice, reasonable use of the kitchen, the bathroom, laundry facilities, all that. They're not rocket science, and they are critical for our student renters, for their safety and for their peace of mind. We also propose to oblige renters to pay their rent on time and to behave themselves and, adhere to the rules of the house. So it's about respect, common sense, protection and practicality, and I commend Mairead on her practical work on this important issue.
Minister, I too want to thank Mairead and Owen for their work on this legislation. It's an important step forward to protect both the students and indeed the homeowners. Now, we don't want to discourage people from renting out a room, but we feel that the generous amounts in tax subsidies that are allowed should come with a requirement to protect those renting out their rooms. But the overall issue of student accommodation has been neglected by this government. We've had promise after promise, but we see the impact in counties like my own, in County Mayo, in terms of students there trying to access colleges and students all over rural Ireland. Indeed, student accommodation has become the biggest barrier for accessing third-level education, and certainly affordable student accommodation. But the whole crisis of student accommodation is just another aspect of the housing crisis, and a decade of underfunding in higher education has left us with a chronic lack of student accommodation. But right now there are shovel-ready projects that could deliver over 3,000 student beds. They have been shelved due to the lack of government support. Now, the announcement that was made before to deliver student beds hasn't come to fruition in Dublin or in Cork, and that is despite DCU alone having planning permission for 990 additional beds since 2019. Now, this government, and specifically the current Taoiseach in his former role as further and higher education, categorically failed student accommodation and failed students across this country in what he promised them. There are thousands of student beds that could be unlocked if the government was serious about addressing the annual crisis in student accommodation. And that is why, Minister, in our alternative budget, we allocated 100 million in capital to unlock all of those projects. This 100 million would be good for students and for parents and would take the pressure off the private rental market. It should be a no-brainer, but instead the government has sat on its hands. Now we need to ensure that all student accommodation projects at advanced stages of planning are supported and construction begins as soon as possible. Fine Gael have had 2 student accommodation strategies and both of those have failed. They have failed students and they have failed rural people and they have failed families. And every August and September we have the same student crisis in accommodation year after year. We need the same ambition that Sinn Féin set out last year for student accommodation to ensure that people can access third level education on an equal basis, no matter where they live across this country.
Look, first of all, I'd like to welcome USI and the student unions of UCD, Trinity, Setu, Maynooth, DCU, University of Galway and IADT and Ogra Sinn Féin, and hopefully I haven't forgotten anybody. But look, in fairness, these are the people that are dealing with it on a day-by-day basis with the accommodation crisis for students. And Minister, I would say they could probably do with a bit more rushing happening, because they are living with out-of-control rents like the rest of society. We know that some of this it has been made a hell of a lot worse because we're dealing with an utterly dysfunctional rental sector. Look, I come in here nearly, I think every week, and you read out what daft.ie and the rents are, and we all know they're through the roof, and I don't know how anyone's able to afford them in any way, shape or form. And obviously we have a huge amount of these rental properties that are now not possible for students. So that's before you talk about the lack of affordability and affordable housing schemes for regular families, and all of it just compounds the problem. That's the particular issue that we have. I remember once upon a time, and once upon a time unfortunately was a hell of a long time ago, when I was in digs, I think it was 60 punt, and you got breakfast and an evening meal and even a roll on Friday when you would leave, but we are well removed from that. And look, here it was an absolutely fabulous service that I got from that particular family, and I accept that there's a huge amount of families that are doing a considerable amount of work absolutely necessary and providing accommodation, but we need to make sure there are protections for these people as well. Look, we all welcome the fact that there is the tax relief that they can avail up to 14,000, and we all welcome any moves that have been made around the medical card and other such necessary moves. But we also need to make sure is that students have the protections that they don't have at the minute. You know, look, we've all heard cases of students being evicted overnight. Students moved into a room and then told that they're going to have to take on child-minding activities. We all know the fact that some of them aren't allowed to lock their own room, and we all know of people who suddenly end up in sharing situations where they didn't necessarily know that's not going to happen. So we need to put the protections in. We need to make sure that it happens quickly. I'll also mention my own town of Dundalk, and obviously we have DKIT. And O'Fee and also Diffie in Drogheda, and the huge amount of people need to come to Dundalk. Huge issues there. Now, I do welcome the fact the joint activities between Maynooth and DKIT and the letter of intent that has been signed. But as per normal, I've gone over my time, so I will desist now.
Minister, most people understand that this type of renting is not the same as renting a full housing unit. Many of the people who do rent out their rooms are decent, they're kind, they're honest people who look after the students really, really well, and the rules won't apply to them. However, this is not always the case, as we don't legislate on the basis. We legislate to protect people from unscrupulous landlords, and we know that there are more than a few of them. And I'll just give you some examples that I got from students. Last year, one was living in Diggs and Blanche. They were told to sleep on the couch, give up the room they were renting when the son came home from their own college midweek unexpectedly. Another situation when the landlord didn't want the student in the house when the family were in the kitchen, couldn't cook and couldn't eat in the kitchen. And another student renting in a well-known private rented accommodation, full of mould, and shared a room with 8 people, faulty electrics in the room, sockets hanging from the wall. It was so bad that it was shut down, one of those rare occasions. And I can tell you, and I think most people and most of the students can tell you, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The bill brought forward by Sinn Féin will provide reasonable protections for tenants and for students. There is also included in the bill as well protections for landlords, that they will also be protected in terms of their ability to collect their rent, and as noted in particular older people who may feel intimidated. And why should we do this? Well, because we're providing a significant tax relief of up to 14,000, very generous tax relief indeed. So we should be ensuring that student renters who make up most of those in this part of the rental sector have at least some protections in return. We need to ensure greater affordability, security and protection for student renters and end what is known as the Wild West of the rental sector that seems to have no rules. And Minister, I'm just going to finish. I'm asking you to support this bill and to join Sinn Féin in standing up for students, because they do need our support in this sector.
I also want to welcome the students in Ogra here tonight. I want to thank Deputy Farrell and Deputy O'Brien for bringing the bill before the House. Minister, the rent-a-room scheme or digs are increasingly becoming a necessity for people, especially students, when there is a lack of available or affordable accommodation. And while incentives have been put in place to make the proposition more attractive for property owners, those benefits aren't accompanied with obligations towards their tenants. Essentially, this means that tenants in digs, essentially students, are without important protections they need. When a student is offered a place for further education, they can often find themselves faced with seeking accommodation in some of the most expensive areas in the country. That's why the rent-a-room scheme might be the most viable option for them. Yet, unlike other renters, the remit of rent pressure zones does not apply to them. This is a shortcoming that really contradicts the whole spirit of this scheme, that is affordability. Additionally, a notice period does not apply to them, nor does it issue privacy of the right to lock the door of their room in which they are staying, or access to the RTB for dispute resolution. These are just some of the issues renters of rooms can face. In worst case scenarios, the lack of controls and regulations can affect the safety of renters, while at the same time it cannot guarantee the same protections of rent controls. Granted, not everyone has a bad experience of this. Indeed, many renters have positive experiences. But when the homeowner has the incentive to avail of a tax relief of up to 14,000 and have the income disregarded from the medical card assessment, then they must be asked to shoulder some of the obligations towards their tenants. This bill seeks to address some of these shortcomings. It will also require the RTB to draw up a standard template statement that sets out the rate of rent, deposit provided and the right to use of certain facilities. This would benefit both sides, including the homeowner, who would also have recourse access to dispute resolution with the RTB. We know that homeowners would find a benefit in this, as studies have indicated this already. But as the matter stands, students who primarily avail of this type of rental option aren't guaranteed financial protections, rights or notice to period, rights to privacy or even basic expectations. This bill seeks to fill this vacuum in the interest of students and in this overall segment of the rental sector. If you wouldn't tolerate that for ourselves, why would we expect students to do so?
I would like to thank my colleagues Maurice Farrell and Owen O'Brien for introducing this bill entitled the Act to amend the Residential Tenancy Act 2004. It is a short bill but a very sensible and practical bill that protects both the students who are entering a room in a home and the proprietor on that home. Under the current setup, students and workers staying in digs have little or no protection under the current legislation. For instance, students have no right to lock their doors, no right to use kitchen facilities. They can be evicted overnight. Their rent can be increased any time without notice, and they have no entitlement to a rent book. Unfortunately, due to neglect of providing proper affordable accommodation over many years, this is the situation we have in 2024. Students are being fleeced and face extortion on unaffordable rents in the so-called free housing market, which leaves them with the only viable path to rent a room in someone's home, very often sharing a room with 4 people or more, reminiscent of the infamous tenements. In my own county of Wexford, due to the unaffordable rents in Dublin, students face a 6-hour all-round commute to Dublin. It was described in the local newspaper and local radio as one of the longest commutes in the country. This is why we need more affordable student accommodation in our capital cities. We recognise that the digs rental sector is vital and very often the only affordable means of thousands of our students. Both student renters and homeowners will benefit from this bill. It will provide real reform and benefits to all concerned, as it will legislate for a formal statutory licence agreement and ensure greater affordability and security to thousands of students. It will also give security and peace of mind to many elderly people who let out a room in their homes, in the form of access to the mechanisms through the RTB. For example, when rents are not being paid on time, or antisocial behaviour takes place, or damages occur in their property. Again, students, renters need to have their rights protected by legislation. This bill will provide a more robust legal standing for both parties, and I welcome the fact that the Minister is not opposing it.
Minister, Dublin City University is one of the top universities in the country, located in Dublin North West. It has a well-earned global reputation for both research and innovation. DCU has 3 academic campuses on the north side of the city, located in Glasnevin and Drumcondra. It has 19,000 students studying there. While many of the students who go to DCU are from Dublin and can consequently travel from their homes to the college. The college does offer on-campus accommodation at both the Glasnevin campus and the St Patrick's campus, which caters for full-time students and for first-year students in student residences. These students are considered the lucky ones, and like many other students in colleges and universities across Ireland, there are thousands more who have to rely on private rental accommodation. Every year around this time, desperation and panic sets in as students begin the process of looking for some sort of accommodation before the university year starts. The benchmark for accommodation is often set very low as students accept any sort of accommodation, no matter how bad it is or how crowded. We have all heard the horror stories of students living in substandard accommodation or having to sleep on couches, on sleeping bags, on the floor, in overcrowded apartments or shared houses. Many others rent a room in a family house, which can have its own problems. But because of the high demand for student accommodation and the chronic lack of properties available to rent and the lack of proper regulation in this sector, students are ripe for exploitation. There are some purpose-built student accommodations, such as the Gateway Student Accommodation and the Aspen Student Accommodation in Ballyone. But the vast majority of students take what they can get, and with that they are vulnerable to exploited rents, overcrowding, a lack of privacy, poor accommodation and no proper legal protections. It is stressful enough studying for a degree without having to fear of being evicted at a moment's notice without any recourse to a legal remedy. There is an over-reliance on the private sector to provide student accommodation, and this has led to a complete lack of affordability in such student accommodation. Also, students living in digs or rent-a-room situations have little or no rights as they face into the university year. They do so without any security of tenure. Students don't need these sort of stresses and can only negatively impact both their mental health and their studies. This bill will help give security, certainty and protection to students. That is why you should support this bill. Thank you.
Minister, I welcome the fact that you're not opposing this legislation, albeit I would have to say that some of the speeches have been decidedly lukewarm. I sense that a lot of what the Minister is saying, there's lots of things that he said, but a lot of it has been about striking the balance. And I actually agree. The balance does need to be struck. I don't think anyone on this side would disagree with that. Nobody, I think it's very clear that any type of regulation would need to be very particular and would need to be very tailored. But what that cannot be is an excuse to do nothing. That cannot be an excuse to do nothing. I don't have a problem with, particularly in a housing crisis, particularly in a student accommodation housing crisis, that you try and use whatever capacity exists. And if that includes digs and where that works and whether it's decent and secure, then that makes sense, absolutely. I don't have a problem with the government incentivising that by way of, or removing barriers at the very least, in terms of the medical cards and some of those other things that have been changed, the GP visit cards, the assessments recently. But the government is providing tax relief of up to 14,000 for rooms that are provided under the rent room scheme. And I don't think it's reasonable to provide that level of support without expecting something in return. One of the things that struck me most from the USI report is the fact that 66% of respondents, that survey, had a written agreement already. In 68% of those cases, the homeowner themselves had suggested putting one in place, so they would benefit from the knowledge that they are standing on secure ground. I know that there are many arrangements out there that are good and decent people are providing accommodation to students who need it, and the relationship there is very good and very, very decent people. But we cannot rely on that to to protect the vulnerable students, to protect the students who are being abused or in any way mistreated. It isn't, nobody would want to see anyone belong to them in a situation that they're told that somebody has to be out like that overnight. Nobody would want to see, particularly women, in a situation where they feel unsafe or vulnerable, or where their access to toilets or showers or anything like that is restricted. There's a problem there. It needs to be addressed in a sensible, balanced way, and we agree with that. But, Minister, that shouldn't be any reason not to proceed and not to address it, because there is an issue there, and that's borne out very clearly from the USI survey.
I've brought this piece of legislation forward in good faith. When I see an issue and that I think that needs to be addressed, then what I do is I go and I try and address it and I bring it in front of this Dáil. I don't believe in just simply shouting from the sidelines. I believe in providing solutions where solutions are needed. And I have to say, Minister, I really welcome the fact that this bill isn't being opposed. And I really do look forward to engaging with yourselves at committee stage on this bill, as we do with most bills. And I really do hope that when we go to that stage, Minister, that you also do that in good faith, and that you proactively look at trying to fix this particular issue. Now, Minister, I have some issues with what the Junior Housing Minister said in relation to this particular bill. I understand that the Junior Housing Minister, of course, isn't here at this moment in time, and I understand that you spoke differently in relation to this. However, the Minister said that this should not be rushed, that this type of legislation should not be rushed. Well, I tell you who needs this legislation to be rushed. It's the student I spoke to who lived in a shed where they paid €700 a month. The shed had been converted into 2 bedrooms with a makeshift kitchen and a shower installed. It had mould and was not suitable for human living. Another occupant who had moved out before this student had come in was paying €600 a month, but the homeowner then increased the rent by €100. Now, that income accrues to the homeowner tax-free. Another student told her story on Monday on RTE about how she lives in an attic where, Minister, she shares a bed with another person. Again, with no rights, but tax-free income for the homeowner. Minister, when I say that I am concerned about the fact that we have students sharing beds with other students in a living capacity, when we have students who cannot lock their door at night, I cannot overemphasise how concerning that is. Minister, I really fundamentally am deeply concerned that this is the kind of situation that will end up as an RTE primetime investigates in years to come. And I tell you, nobody can say that they didn't know of the dangers and the concerns that they faced. Other women have told me that they were required to undertake child-minding duties if they wanted to keep their rooms. And I've heard plenty of stories of students who were turfed out overnight with no time to try and source alternative accommodation. And Minister, the new academic year is just around the corner, so there is a rush. And to say that there isn't a rush simply is nonsense. And when that minister, the housing minister, tells us that there is no rush, well, there seems to be no rush in publishing the student accommodation strategy. There's no rush in giving 1 red cent for student accommodation in last year's budget. But where is there a rush? There's a rush in providing Vulture Fund student accommodation, where we have a situation now where Vulture Funds own more student accommodation in Dublin than the Dublin universities themselves. Now, Minister, the other minister, the housing minister, seemed to have bent over backwards, and I quote when he says that it will not be in operation when the new academic year starts in September. Now, the ironic thing is that the minister clearly doesn't realise is that actually the majority of homeowners support this type of legislation. They want to know that they have greater securities too. And Minister, I'll give you one example. Imagine if you're an elderly woman renting out a room, you're left in with a number of extra rooms left in your house, and you want to make a few bob because there's a huge cost of living crisis. And then that person that's renting off you says, look, I don't have the rent this week. And then the next week, sorry, Minister, I actually don't, or sorry, to the woman, I'm sorry, I don't have the rent this week, and the next week, and the next week. That woman needs to have rights too, and needs to be able to ensure that they can enact what is in that legislation, and that is why it is so fundamentally important. And I will just finish with this, Minister. Minister, today you've brought forward your intention to enact fast-track legislation in relation to the issue of 51-week lease requirements, and I think that is very welcome. But here, there was no rush, unfortunately, either. And the concerning thing is that there are students who may have already signed a 51-week lease contract that it won't impact. But I do think it is very welcome, and I hope that it is brought into legislation and adopted as soon as possible. Look, Minister, I welcome the fact that you're here, Minister, and I really welcome the fact that you are not opposing this, and I welcome the fact that we will discuss this at committee level. But the previous Minister did annoy me with some of his comments, so thank you.
The question is now that the bill be read a second time. Is that agreed? Agreed. Agreed.